Hello, everybody. Welcome to the War Room Podcast, the war and conflict themed podcast, where every episode we discuss a different topic from war and conflict. I am one of your hosts, Kyle. Joined with me, as always, is my co-host, James, also known as my dad. Dad, how you doing?
Hello, universe. I'm doing good.
Good. I think we're both pretty excited about this episode. If you've seen the tagline, you know that today we're gonna be talking about the Navajo Code Talkers. I should say specifically we're going to be talking about the Native Code Talkers. Excuse me. Just because we use that term to reference the particular group of Navajo Code Talkers, which was a group, of people that served, but Native peoples have served the military, the United States military, in every major conflict since the Revolutionary War,
Since the beginning,
various capacities. Yeah, but there was multiple tribes that all participated in the same actions. So we're gonna talk a little bit about all of them, but that is the one that's most commonly heard of is the Navajo Code Talkers.
yes.
So we kind of want to go into some of their history, some of the history of Native Americans in the U.S., specifically in the military, as well as just in general, and then go into World War One. Code Talkers used in World War One. That's right, they were used in World War One. In case you didn't know, which I actually didn't before getting into this, and then the larger impact of their actions in World War Two, for what we'll talk about. I'm super excited. I had a good time doing the research for this, honestly. I don't know about you.
No, I think the moment that this was brought up as a suggestion, I loved the idea immediately. So yeah,
Yeah, I would agree.
This one I think is a pretty good. I think this will be a good one. I think it'll be good.
Yeah, no, I think so as well. And if you think so as well, please, would recommend, if you've been enjoying these episodes, or if you want to catch us in the future, to give us a follow on whatever podcast service you're listening to us on. We are available on all of them. You can also check out the video version of this on YouTube, where we're all, you can see the both of us, our pretty faces, talking through this. Links are in the description for this podcast episode. Also, you can always catch us live at twitch.tv/War Room Podcast, where you can come in. We have our chat open. We have people ask questions. You can interact with us live. We tend to do a bonus section afterwards as well, where we talk about the whatever we kind of want to talk about. It's usually on subject of what we just talked about, but could be an interesting conversation. Love to have you in there to participate as well. We usually do these every other Sunday. I should say, if you've noticed that an episode is missing, we were both out sick, so unfortunately we had to skip, I think, one cycle or one episode.
Yeah, it was one.
But we're back, and I'm excited to be back. So with that being said, let's go ahead and hop into the topic. Now, before we get into the Code Talkers themselves, I want to talk actually a little bit about pre-revolutionary America and colonial America, and Native Americans' representation in the military at that time. From around the mid 1600s to mid 1700s, we have a pretty significant chunk of wars, conflicts that happen in the American territories, between the French, the English, and sometimes the Spanish, depending on which of them we're talking about. Now, specifically, if you're interested, that's the King William's War, which happened between the French and the English, the Queen Anne's War, which was the French, Spanish, and English, King George's War, which was the French and English, and the French and Indian War, which is something a lot of people are familiar with, which is one towards the end that actually happened between French and English people. Now, the interesting thing about all these conflicts is that you can actually go through and trace, not only were these direct conflicts with the colonists of each of those nations, that they actually heavily relied on military support from various tribes on both sides. So there was actually multiple engagements in multiple battles where you have a contingent of a few tribes that are allied with the French, a few tribes that are allied with the English, fighting for those colonial powers, usually for the sake of some kind of treaty that's been set or some kind of process that's been set for them upon the completion of their conflict. The interesting thing is you can see this happen through all of these wars, but there's a trend of these tribes fighting for that particular conflict or for that particular colony, them not getting the deal that they were told they were going to get through that conflict, and then either switching or fighting the colonists in that case. Now, this is something we're going to get into probably a lot more later, but I do want to just mention this up front, just so y'all know. We're going to be using the words like Native people or Native Americans a lot, but the Native people and Native Americans, especially at this time, are vast and various and have very little in common with each other a lot of the times.
They're their own separate entities. They're their
Yeah.
own tribal nations.
Yeah. These
with their own culture, their own language, their own religions, and so for ease, we're bracketing them into one term just for ease of conversation.
Yeah,
because it gets very confusing when you talk about the Hopi and the Cherokee and the Chippewa. You know, there's the Sioux, the Fox. There's so many different nations.
Yeah,
and they did change sides a lot. And so it would just become kind of confusing.
Yeah. It would end up just a full episode on pre-colonial history in America, which is an interesting one, but also not the one we're going for now. So once we get it later on, we actually are going to start looking into more individual tribes. But I just want to head that on the front end, just so everyone's clear that Native American is a really, really loosely fitting term that we've used to just kind of put a very diverse group of people together. That was like our early history with Native Americans. It was essentially having them help us fight both other colonies as well as other native tribes that we were trying to get land from or get resources from or what have you. Now, once we get into the 1800s, where we have the U.S. established, that's when we get into what people have heard of a lot of the relocations of Native peoples, things like that. If you've heard of the Trail of Tears, that happens during this time frame. One thing I wanted to point out, because this is actually something I wasn't taught, is that we specifically call out the Trail of Tears because that's the one that was coined with that phrase. But we actually did these mass removals of Native peoples. Give or take, we did it about every year or so for like a decade or two. It wasn't just the Trail of Tears. We did it here and here and here. It wasn't a singular event. Yeah, exactly. And it wasn't a singular tribe either. We did it over and over and over and over again. And each time we did it, it was just as horrible. It was just as it caused just as much casualties for the people we were doing it to. That one particular gets called out because there's that like historical context of that word around that event, but that is not a single event. That technically is that individual, but it happened very frequently. That relocation process. So that's us kind of moving these Native peoples into reservations that we've set up, or just initially before those reservations were set up, just out of areas that we wanted to take. Essentially like, hey, I know we said that this land was yours via this treaty. We don't care. We need it. So you got to get out. And then would march them across vast swaths of the United States with little, resources paid for it.
I think there's something important that kind of gets overlooked, and it's citizenship. And so why is that important? It's important because these were not considered citizens.
Mhm.
So you were able to treat them um, in a different way because they had no representation.
Yeah, I believe actually at this time they weren't even considered identified nations either, or recognized nations.
No,
So they were
we
simultaneously not citizens of the U.S. and weren't recognized as citizens of their own nation.
exactly. And so you'd give a person a treaty and you give them, okay, this is now your land, right?
Mhm.
But they're not citizens. So if I decide to change the deal, because our governmental structure has a revolving door of people that are representatives.
Mm.
And so if a lot of these tribes would make deals with military commanders, right? Well, as a congressman, I don't feel necessarily obliged to keep a contract or a deal that somebody else made.
Mhm.
Or if the previous senator or the previous entity made that deal, I don't feel obligated because that's not my deal.
Mhm.
And so they run into a problem of people not owning any of the um, agreements.
Yeah.
And our system is literally designed with all these back doors,
Mhm.
and it always has been.
Yeah.
But it's easier when a person is not a citizen for you to take from them,
Mhm.
because you're like, well, this is all of our land, from coast to coast. This is the U.S.,
Yeah.
right? And then there's these little pockets that don't belong to us. Well, that doesn't make any sense. So if you think of it like your home, it's like walking into your kitchen and the refrigerator is off limits.
Mhm.
That belongs to the neighbor.
Mhm.
So it 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 doesn't make sense to a lot of people. Like, wait a
Mhm.
minute. Well, if it's ours, then why can't we use it? Well, because we gave it to somebody else. Well, then take it back.
Mhm.
So I'm not saying that that is right in any way,
Yeah.
but I do want to explain that there is a reason why
Mhm.
some of these things were easy, got out of control very easily, and
Yeah.
it's because of no representation,
Mhm.
no citizenship, and this revolving door of people making agreements that either weren't actually authorized to make that agreement
Mhm.
and they didn't have the power to make that agreement, or somebody else with more power deciding that that agreement is no good
Yeah.
and going back on it.
Yeah.
And that's a plight
Mhm.
that honestly to this day still goes on.
Yeah. No.
They are underrepresented, and
Mhm.
uh, anyways,
Yeah, yeah. No,
so
I agree. Yeah, so that is a lot of this took place going into the mid 1800s, and there is a whole bunch of there's a whole bunch of history there that is happening as well that we're going over or skipping over because we need we have a very specific thing we want to get to, but
yes,
it's a fascinating history. I would highly recommend anyone who doesn't know anything about that, if you just look up timeline of Native Americans in the U.S. There's a bunch of federal websites that actually have really great timelines that are pretty distinct on some interesting things that happen through there. Now you were going to want to talk about the boarding school specifically, right?
yes.
Go for
Do
it.
we want to go there
Yeah.
now, or do you want to do the declaration first?
Up to you.
All right, let me do the declaration
Okay.
first, because I think this one is pretty profound. It was for me, it was pretty profound.
Mm-hmm.
And so, basically, the Declaration of Independence. It was authored by 4 or 5 people. They were considered to be some of the brightest uh, minds of that age. Um, Benjamin Franklin had something to do with it. Thomas Jefferson had something to do with it. And I will say that a lot of it was cannibalized from other documents, the Magna Carta. I don't know. There's some other documents that were used and kind of pulled apart to create this one document.
Mm-hmm.
So in the second line or paragraph, it states this: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So in the opening document, it talks about how everyone has unalienable rights. However, when you get to the grievances of King, was it George?
Yes, yeah. So for
King
context, for everyone, with the Declaration of Independence, there was a section of grievances to the British government, essentially explaining the reason for this declaration. So, the Declaration of Independence is all that like stuff about the country specifically, but this is essentially a document listing why, or a section listing why explicitly we are declaring independence.
And the very first line of the section under grievances, this is what it says: "He has excited domestic insurrections among us." By he, they're talking about King George. Okay. "And has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers and merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions." What they are talking about here is actually the native peoples as well as the slaves. It doesn't say slaves in here, but they're actually talking about both.
Yeah, that is the domestic insurrections part at the beginning.
So, in the very beginning of our nation, the common thought about the natives peoples was that they were Indian savages. Okay. I say that because this is touted as one of the greatest documents that has ever been written for freedom, right? But we ignore the fact that we literally don't actually believe in equality at this point. We believe in equality for people that are like us at that point, but not anyone that is other or different. They are inferior. They're not even humans. In some people viewed them as not even human. And so, as enlightened as they may have been, they were not enlightened enough to have true equality, to understand that humans are human and humans are all different.
Yeah.
And to say that that is okay. So even in this document that gets pushed all the time as, freedom and blah, in its very body, we are literally degrading and denigrating an entire multiple nations of people. And I don't think a lot of people realize that part of their problem with the crown was the fact that they couldn't abuse these nations, and that they would dream to stand up to these folks. So I thought that was pretty profound. I never noticed it in there until I started researching.
Yeah. No, I thought that was interesting. And remember, this is a document declaring independence for the United States of America. The Native Americans, again, helped in the American Revolution. Various tribes helped the United States secure its independence from Britain. So, like, on
now, I will say that a lot of tribes fought for Britain as well.
That is true. Again, there were tribes that fought for Britain as well, because, again, that's not a monolith of people. But it is interesting that they also did treat them as a monolith of people. That doesn't reference like particular tribes. That doesn't reference particular groups that they did
honestly,
have
they
partners
were
or
all
treaties
savages. They were all savages. Didn't matter.
Yeah.
They weren't understood, and they weren't recognized as savages.
Yeah.
And so it allows you to justify doing some pretty terrible things to them. So I'll move on now to the boarding schools.
Gotcha. So these are mid 1800s, right?
For the boarding schools?
Yeah, and late
after. late, I would say the late 1800s.
Okay.
So it started 1860. So
Okay.
is that late or
I
middle?
guess mid.
Middle?
Yeah, mid.
Middle 1800s? Okay. So the boarding school experience for Indian children began in 1860. When the Bureau of Indian Affairs established the first Indian boarding school in on the Yakima Indian Reservation in Washington State. The goal of these reformers was to educate as a tool to assimilate, all right, Indian tribes into the mainstream American way of life. It's a very Protestant ideology from the 19th century. By that, I mean that there was a Protestant movement in the 19th century to do this at a lot of different places, set up these mission schools to train the indigenous people in a specific culture. And we'll get into that a little more here shortly. By the 1800s, the U.S. Had Operation 60 schools. Okay. About 6,200 Indian children, including the reservation day schools and reservation boarding schools. So it's, 60 schools. That's quite a few schools. 6,000 kids. It's a lot. And I say that's a lot, but it's a lot based off of the amount of peoples available. So while that might not be a lot of children, 6,000 is not a lot of children for 3 million people, but it is for 150,000 people.
Yeah.
Based off of their population
Per capita,
it's a very large number.
Yeah.
At that time. There were the late performer and Indian activist Floyd Redcrow Westerman was haunted by his memories of the boarding school. As a child, he left the reservation in South Dakota to go to a boarding school in North Dakota. Even 60 years after that incident, he still remembers watching his mother from the window. And initially he thought maybe she wanted to get rid of him, but he did notice that she was crying. He spent the rest of his childhood in boarding schools, far from his family and his South Dakota tribe. He went on to become an actor, an activist, and a songwriter. And so he managed to do some positive things, even though he did go through this boarding school process. But it did impact him. A lot of his songs are him, telling a story about these boarding schools. It was that big of an impact on his life. The federal government began sending the American Indians to off-reservation boarding schools in the 1870s. So within 10 years, it wasn't even on reservation. This was off of reservations even. And there was a program where for summer vacation or during the summer, they would send these children into rural American, families' homes. As kind of a way to let them see how an American family lives or something along those lines. So an Army officer, Richard Pratt, he founded the first of the schools. And so he had a very profound effect on how these schools were set up and their policies. And he based the education program on something that he had developed for an Indian prison. So he took the model for the Indian prison that he set up and used that to set up and design the first boarding school and created policies for a lot of the boarding schools to come. So it's kind of important. That's an important thing.
Mhm.
Okay. It's an important thing because the viewpoint of how you treat a prisoner and a convict is different than how you treat an innocent child
Yeah.
who has done nothing wrong.
Yeah.
But he described his philosophy in a speech in 1892. So these are his words.
Mhm.
A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. So now this individual started the first school, right? And even 20 plus years later, this is his opinion
Mhm.
on the matter. And this man was making policy for these schools. And this statement is very important to me. Kill the Indian in him and save the man.
Mhm.
The true goal of these schools was to transform the native peoples both inside and out. It was to exterminate their identities and create ones that they could control.
Mhm.
And there's a word for that, and it's genocide.
Mhm.
Now, it's not genocide in the aspect of going through and just murdering peoples.
Mhm.
What was the name for this genocide? Is it cultural genocide? What's it
So
called?
yeah, this is like an interesting subject if you look into like our current studies on genocide and our current looks on genocide as for identifying it in other nations as it arises, as well as studying it historically. There actually isn't a distinction between cultural genocide and uh, genocide through ethnic cleansing, because they are two sides of the same coin. They usually occur in the same thing. So if one is happening, it is not effectively that different than the other one. If you are ethnically cleansing through murder a group of people so that they no longer exist, that's not that actually great of a distinction than
if you take their culture, their religion,
correct.
their language,
Yeah,
and their identity.
They're unable to speak their language and unable to worship their gods and unable to go to their holy sites and unable to continue on the land that they've built and unable to interact with their ancestors. You are effectively killing them of that culture, which is the point of genocides. It's the ethnic destruction
to get rid of
a
it.
people.
And so the reason that I want to make sure we use that term and that we're using it correctly is because that happened here in America. This enlightened country, that is something that we were doing, and we need to own that we were capable of doing so, and recognize that the wrongness of it. Period.
Yeah, when talking about the Holocaust, Hitler once is quoted as saying, "Remember, no one considers the genocide of the savage Indian people by the United States." Essentially, his argument was the United States already did a mass genocide, and no one mentions it, so we can do it to the Jewish people, and that's fine. As long as we're the victors, no one will say anything.
Now, 50 years after Pratt's, philosophy, it was still common. So in 1945, Bill Wright, a Patwin Indian, was sent to the Stewart Indian School in Nevada. He was 6 years old. Wright remembers the matrons bathing him in kerosene and shaving his head because the Native Americans, not all the tribes, but a lot of the tribes kept their hair quite long, and that was very important to their identity. Kerosene is extremely irritating to the skin, and it is very flammable, by the way. It actually makes you sick. If you are bathed in kerosene, it seeps into your pores, and it actually makes you sick. It's a horrifying thing to do to a 6-year-old. This is a 6-year-old.
Yeah.
Wright remembers the students at the federal boarding schools being forbidden to express their culture. absolutely forbidden.
Mm.
Everything from wearing long hair to speaking even a single Indian word was met with very, 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 very hostile retribution
Mm-hmm.
And punishment. He said that he lost not only his language, but also his American Indian name. So even the name that he showed up with was taboo. He remember, so these are his words. I remember coming home and my grandma asking me to talk Indian to her, and I said, "Grandma, I don't understand you." She said, "Then who are you?" Wright says he told her his name was Billy. "Your name is not Billy. Your name is Ta'aruhum," she told him, and I probably didn't say that right. And I went, "That is not what they told me." So this is an indoctrination of sorts, but it's truly a genocide.
Yeah.
Your own name is not able to be uttered. And this is a fairly horrifying thing for children. It is absolute abuse. And it was done under very little oversight.
Yeah.
And the oversight that was there was okay with that type of behavior. It's horrifying.
Yeah.
I don't want to make the episode about these boarding schools, but I did want to show the different viewpoints, Pratt's viewpoint, and the people that attended the school's viewpoint. Now, what I want to say is that I feel horrible about what took place, but I can't take any responsibility for it. I wasn't even born. But I do believe that we have to, at some point, own our mistakes and learn from them. I can't pay anyone back for what happened to someone. I can't rewind history and I can't change the clock, but I can recognize what happened and make sure that those types of things don't happen again or are not acceptable to happen.
Yeah.
But yeah, so
yeah, I would agree. A couple things to quickly add to that. Ginger posted this in chat, but the kids who were sent to those families were oftentimes actually sent to work for those farms as well. And the money that was made by the child was given to the school. So that was probably a way to seek funding shittily, as well as some other. I assume they're it almost like a study abroad type of thing, and that you immerse yourself in the culture, you absorb it, or something like that.
I forgot this last thing. So here's the last thing about the boarding schools. They still exist. They actually still have. There are not very many left, but there are still Native American boarding schools. They have very little funding. Now, I don't know if I'm certain that there have been some reforms in that regard.
Yeah. So actually, real quick, I looked into that. It seems that the boarding schools that are still exist are essentially have been taken back by a lot of those tribes.
Yes.
So they do kind of the opposite now. Instead of removing,
they teach their culture.
Exactly. They try to incorporate their culture in with an existing high school system. So you actually won't see them. You won't see them called Choctaw boarding school or something like that. It's usually
correct.
Name of the tribe high school. And then it receives, I think, as I understand it, receives some funding from the Department of the Interior.
Yes. They have very limited funding.
Yeah.
And they're like I say, they're being operated differently, obviously. But I do want to let people know that they still that program is still in existence. It is different, and there's a lot less funding for it, which
Gets into a whole thing about education and funding and stuff.
Exactly. But it is something that still is around. It's still it's just not being practiced in the same manner.
Yeah, it's in a much more responsible, and I do think there's something valuable in taking, especially the people who were so destroyed by this system, taking the system and making it work for them. I think that's an interesting concept.
I agree. I absolutely agree.
One thing I did want to talk about as well is that I do want to be clear that we didn't, if we are doing the distinguishing method of there's cultural genocide, or there's genocide via cultural aspects and genocide via ethnic cleansing, we actually did both to the Native Americans, just to be clear. We also just went through and killed them frequently and in multiple engagements. So I was thinking about that. I do want to be clear that we're not saying that we didn't do that. But this specific, the policies we're talking about fall into that other category of genocide.
Yes.
Because
why
choose?
I will say that in one effect, it did not work in the way that they had hoped it would work. Their hope was that within a couple of generations, you essentially kill off these tribes. I would say that there are probably some of the nations that don't exist anymore. I am sure that there are several tribes that were small enough at the time that the few generations that these boarding schools had basically wiped out that culture.
Yeah.
And I would like to keep in mind that when this process started, we were still at war with the Native peoples. We were still engaging in conflicts with the Native peoples. So
yeah,
it was just another front in that war, if I'll be honest.
Yeah.
And it just it was a way for you to attack children, but without actual murdering them. You just murdering their culture.
Yeah.
So it is a terrible policy, and but I wanted to highlight it because it's important that if it had worked, then the people we're getting ready to talk about would not have been able to do what they did.
Yeah.
And then that's why I wanted to bring this up, is that we're lucky that this didn't succeed, because it allowed us to be able to do some pretty amazing stuff later on.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's important to set the tone for the things leading into this, because I think it makes the contributions of the Native people in World War I and World War II and Vietnam and the Gulf War,
Korea,
and Iraq and Korea, and every major conflict that has existed in American history, that much more impressive. I actually didn't know this before I did my research, but it turns out that Native people per capita are actually the most represented group in the U.S. military via recruits. Despite only being around 1.4% of the population, Native people make up about 1.7% of the U.S. military. So dramatically more than they actually make up of the population in the United States. They also have the highest concentration of women service members of any other group in the United States. Currently, right? Yeah. As well as, I believe, I looked at some of the trends historically. That's been the case for a long time. So it's not just that it's now. Native peoples have historically done more than their fair share.
And I want to just add that number is also including the Native Alaskans.
Yes. Yeah. Anyone who's identified as or self-identified as a Native individual, I think, by a certain percentage or something.
But they are a separate entity also.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. But that being said, it is a pretty. That's not a thing I knew. I didn't realize how intrinsically tied Native culture is actually with the military, and how represented they are within it. Going into World War I, actually, we had about 12,000 Native Americans join the front. So 6,000 of them joined voluntarily. 6,000 of them were drafts.
Yes.
We entered, so like around 1917 is when we entered World War One. This had already been happening in Europe. We've discussed World War One pretty extensively in previous episodes. I'm not going to get too much into the nitty gritty. But one thing I think is interesting is at the time of World War One's advent, and at the time of those Native Americans joining, the majority of them were not citizens of the United States of America. We had not passed the Indian Citizenship Act, which was passed after the war, which gave them full citizenship to the United States. I say full citizenship, but gave them citizenship to the United States. We still oppress them, but that's a different conversation. So these are people that don't actually have the citizenship to the country that they are currently fighting for.
Yet we can still draft them.
Yeah, but they can still be drafted, which is hilarious. Now, we're talking about the Code Talkers, but 2/3 of all the Native people that served in World War One actually served in infantry positions. Most commonly, they served in scout and sniper positions. Turns out that actually kind of flows back to that view of the Native Americans specifically as a warlike people. It was considered, and this is a quote, that they would be comfortable in these positions because it is closest to their nature. Because of this, they actually suffered casualty rates at 5%, compared to the overall for the United States forces, which was 1%. So literally 5 times more likely to die, because they were typically put in positions where they were in the more combat-driven areas.
Correct.
Yeah, if you're interested in World War One in minority representation, we also have a great episode that I love on the Harlem Hellfighters. If you go back in our
that was a good episode.
Podcast history, who experienced kind of a similar thing to this. But that being said, of the ones that didn't serve in a combat setting, there are actually quite a few that served in the telecommunications department. Now, very quickly, to talk about World War One, there was kind of a couple different ways we did communications. So we had messages systems, or more rudimentary messaging systems, so runners, carrier pigeons, things like that. That was usually when electronic systems failed. I don't think, I'm just going to mention this cursory, this could be its own topic, but the amount of telephone wire ran in World War One is insane. Most of those trenches, underneath the trenches, had miles and miles of lines of telephone wire to be able to communicate through the trenches. They needed people operating those phones. They needed people receiving those messages. But there was a very particular invention that actually came just before, I think, World War One, when it was actually starting to get implemented, which is radio. That was the first time we were able to use it in a major conflict, was in World War One. That introduces very specifically why the Code Talkers were first created, which is when you have a radio signal, and this is true with telephone lines as well. You can tap into a telephone line and immediately hear the things. It is a little bit more difficult because you need to physically get contact over it, and that line needs to be active. But it's not difficult in the sense that you can't do it. It's just a different kind of task to get there.
It's actually really easy to do.
Yeah,
it's really easy to plug into the system.
Yeah, there's the difficulty of getting
especially
to it.
When there's tons of wire.
Yeah, and knowing which one to tap in and stuff.
That's the one that's the hard part.
Yeah. But that being said, when we look at radio at the time, it was very easy. One, it was very easy to see where we set up radio because they were massive. Yep. It was not a super efficient system. Two, radio signals at the time, you could just passively intercept these things.
Yeah, as long as you figured out a frequency, you could just listen.
Exactly, which raised an issue because while we had codes for being able to talk through the radio system, they were normally based in mathematical progression. So there were mathematical based codes or they were based in some kind of European language. The Germans were actually very good at figuring these things out. It wasn't until towards the end of the war that this thought started to. I think it was kind of by accident that it actually happened. But some of the members in the telecommunications that were, I believe it was Cherokee and Choctaw, started to actually use their language for communication on the line. Specifically, the Messe Orgon, I'm butchering that name, probably offensive, was heavily attributed to the participation of those two groups to be able to send coded messages in their own language. They could be decoded on the other end. That the Germans were unable to have any kind of deciphering line. For example, if everyone's familiar with the Rosetta Stone, that's the tablet that gave us the reference point to be able to translate. I think it was Babylonian.
It was 3 different languages.
Oh yeah,
The Rosetta Stone was three languages: Egyptian and
or Sumerian, maybe.
It might be Sumerian. Sumerian and Egyptian, I think, were the 2 big ones. That Sumerian, we had all this Sumerian text, we had all this Egyptian text, all this stuff on walls and in tablets. We had no idea what the heck any of it meant.
Yeah.
Until the Rosetta Stone.
Yeah. So we found a reference point that the language is based off of that we were able to use to be able to decode the rest of the language. Germans didn't have any reference point. Native languages, are almost exclusively oral. When there were written histories applied to them, they were applied post hoc by people coming in and saying, "Hey, we need to be able to write down your language. You need to come up with a written version." So it was literally like a deliberate effort on their end. But their root of those languages is nothing that exists in Europe. You would, and oftentimes there's actually native languages that aren't connected to each other within America as well.
No, there's a ton of different languages.
Yeah, they all have different roots too, which is for a code makes for a very interesting prospect. Now, for World War I, the code talkers were only used in a couple of key battles because, again, this system wasn't really devised until towards the end of the conflict. Excuse me. But it was used, and it did help in some very key battles. That specific offensive is touted as essentially the start of the end of the German occupation, or of the Germans' ability to fight in that area in 1918. So that attributed pretty heavily to the end of World War I. But it leads into what we now know is a very interesting prospect going into World War II, which I'll let you expand on.
Yeah, so give me 1 second here. So during times of war, secure communications can mean the difference between life and death, literally, absolute life or death. But it can also help define victory and defeat. So in the beginning of World War II, we had used the code talkers in World War I. So, but we were worried that the languages that we had used there may have been compromised by the Japanese and the Germans. So the idea is to pick completely different languages and actually make a code within the language itself. And so the code isn't the language. All right. A lot of people just assume that it was just native peoples talking to each other in their native tongue, and that was the code. It's actually not the code. They actually used the native language to develop a code. And this is a very profound thing. And I'll get a little bit more into why this is very profound here in a bit. They were not this code is not based off of technology or mathematical equations, and so it makes it almost impossible for someone to break it unless you capture somebody and they actually give you the code. You really there's nothing for you to use to break it. The only other way that you can break the code is if you get enough data over a length of time.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, okay, they used this word and then this ship got bombed. Okay, that must mean this ship.
Yeah.
You would have to have a length of time and a
Mm-hmm.
body of data to break this code.
Yeah.
And because there's so many messages traveling so fast, it's difficult for anyone to really lock down anything.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very important. So in 1942, the U.S. Marine Corps began recruiting and training Navajo men to be code talkers. Carl Gorman was the first of the Navajo to join. And he said, for us, everything is memory. It's part of our heritage. We have no written language. Our songs, our prayers, our stories, they're all handed down from grandfather to father to children. And we listen, we hear, we learn to remember everything. It's part of our training. The reason that's important is because in a language that is not written, that is oral, it requires you to remember a history. You have to remember all these different things. And so when you go to develop a code, it makes it very easy for those people to learn that code and implement it. They're already used to doing it. And so it's an asset militarily that people probably undervalue.
Mm-hmm.
So at first, there were 29 individuals recruited. And then that number went up to, I believe, 400. Now, this is just in the Marine Corps, and these are just the Navajo themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So the code talkers, the native peoples, would develop the code within the language. And it was a phonic alphabet and used word substitutions. So, for example, a fighter plane or fighter aircraft became a hummingbird. A turtle would be a tank.
Mm.
A battleship would be a whale. I think a submarine was a metal.
It was ironfish, which
ironfish
actually didn't exist. That wasn't like a word that they had. There was no word for the concept of submarine. So during this devisement, a lot of this was also, how do we translate this thing that doesn't actually have a word and give it some kind of meaning in the language?
Yeah. And that's what I'm getting at, is that even if you were to stumble on, even if the Germans or the Japanese were to stumble onto something for the language, it wouldn't make any sense to them.
Mm-hmm.
Because the code was created. It's still a code.
Yeah.
So they're like, hummingbird, what the hell?
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't make any sense to them because they wouldn't know what the meaning of that word is. One, they have to figure out the meaning of the word in the language.
Mm-hmm.
But two, they'd have to learn the meaning of that word in the code on top of that. So it's a multi-layered thing, and it's brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
Now, other branches of the military recruited Native Americans from the Cherokee, the Cheyenne, the Chippewa, Choctaw, Comanche, the Cree, the Crow, the Hopi, the Kiowa.
Yeah, I think it was 16
a lot of different
tribes in total.
To use literally for their language, for the linguistics, for language alone. Okay, this is not all the people that were frontline fighters.
Yeah. But
I'm saying specifically, we recruited from all these different tribes to make codes to be used all over the Pacific and all over Europe, all over Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So this was a very big, profound thing that is being done. After the codes were established, the trained code talkers joined the combat units around the world. The Navajo and the Hopi were assigned to service in the Pacific. Specifically through the Navy and the Marine Corps. The Comanches fought the Germans in Europe. The Meshawakas fought in North Africa. And the code talkers from the other tribes fought in various locations in Europe, the Pacific, all over. Mm-hmm. Because the code was considered to be so important, many of the code talkers were assigned an actual bodyguard. And they were not allowed to go on their own anywhere. That's how important that was the value
Mm-hmm.
of this code. You literally assigned a body that could be fighting someone else to literally guard the guy on the radio.
Yeah.
No other time in history will you see someone guarding a radio operator.
Mm-hmm.
That's how important they were.
Yeah, the Japanese actually in the Pacific, very specifically, were known for targeting code talkers and radio men specifically, because they knew that was a way to cripple communications in the area. So if enemy snipers or enemy combatants saw a group of people, they would see officers, medics, radio men, and code talkers as the 4 primary categories to attack first. Because of their importance,
above and beyond everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a testament to how important this is. Fighting in the battles of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Tinian, Saipan, and D-Day, Normandy, the code talkers saved lives by signaling enemy movements, transmitting orders, and coordinating attacks under fire. Major Howard Cooper, a signal officer commanding the code talkers, he said, this is his quote, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." And Iwo Jima is the place that we raised the flag, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's one of the most iconic images in American history is these individuals raising this flag. One of those individuals in the photograph that was taken, and the photograph was the second time that flag was raised, was actually a Native American right from our hometown here. He was actually Ira Hayes, and he was a Pima nation. It's what is it? Pima some tribe.
Yeah.
And that's right here, in Tucson, essentially.
Yeah.
The code talkers were very proud of their accomplishments in combat. However, they wouldn't talk about it because this was classified all the way up until 1968. So from 42 to 68, nobody even knew this existed because nobody would talk about it because the code was never broken.
Mm-hmm.
Even after a war on multiple fronts, those codes were never broken. And so they kept that as a secret in case they needed to use it in the future. That's how profound and important this was. And these individuals weren't recognized for it literally until basically after 1968, because it was a big, huge secret.
Yeah. I think a lot of them didn't actually get their congressional medals. Not even just Medal of Honors, but just congressional medal, like gold medals and things. Until 2001, I believe, is when the code talkers actually received theirs.
In the 90s, there was a movement where they were recognized, and then in the 2000s, they actually started receiving medals and things like that. So I want to explain just why this is such a cool thing.
Yeah.
So the code talkers could encode and decode a message in about 20 seconds. So I'm going to explain encode first. So encode is quite literally, I have something that I want to say. So I would come to an individual and I'd say, there are 200 Japanese on Hill 228. And that message would be intended for another individual, let's say an artillery battery. In order for me to encode that message using an SOI, it's a signal operating instructions, okay? It would take me 3 to 4 minutes to encode that message using a mathematical
progression system.
Phonic progression system. All right. It would take me 3 to 4 minutes just to encode it, to send it.
Mm-hmm.
An individual would have to receive it, write it down, and then decode it. And then he would open up a book and he would go, okay, A today is Q. It would take 3 to 4 minutes to decode that message. Now, keep in mind that you're looking at, we'll just call it 10 minutes that's taken place, right? In that 10 minutes, what has happened on the battlefield? People are moving. People are going to different positions. Now, in that 10 minutes, let's say the people up on that hill have actually taken to the top of that hill.
Yeah.
Now, all of a sudden, artillery starts landing on top of that hill, and U.S. forces are actually dying.
Yeah.
Because it took 10 minutes for that transmission to be encoded and decoded.
Yeah.
All right. The code talkers are doing it in 20 seconds. 20 seconds is a long time when you're being shot at, I guarantee you.
Yeah.
But in battlefield time, it's a very short period of time. There's not a ton of things that are moving, transpiring, or changing in 20 seconds.
Yeah.
So in that same scenario, they send a message, hey, there's 200 Japanese on top of hill 152. The artillery person knows what 152 is. He's got that plotted on a map. He literally puts that into a firing solution, and boom, you're killing Japanese.
Yeah.
Okay. 5 minutes of bombarding the top of that hill, another code talker message comes out, hey, stop firing on hill one. I don't remember what
226 or something. I think
226.
Yeah.
Hill 226. Stop firing on hill 226. 20 seconds later, somebody translates and says, hey, ceasefire, ceasefire, ceasefire. And now the individuals on that hill can actually charge in and possibly take that hill with a lot less casualties because the Japanese are in disarray because they've just been bombarded.
Yeah.
That is the importance of this system. Is that it wasn't just that it was a code that couldn't be broken. It was a code that was very, very fast.
Yeah.
It's brilliant in its simplicity. It's profound how much of an advantage it gives you. So during 2 days, the first 2 days in the Battle of Iwo Jima, there were 6 code talkers there, and they sent and received over 800 messages without one error. Without an error. I guarantee you, any of the messages that were sent using the SOI, there are almost always errors because it is a labor-intensive thing. It's not something that you know, so it's something you're using a book to write and pull information out of. So there's always errors in encoding and decoding those types of messages. Not always, but there's it's more probable that there's going to be an error. Now, we kind of talked about their efforts really weren't even recognized until the 90s and the 2000s. But when you can send 800 messages, that's over 800 things that some of it was benign. Hey, move X people from here to here. Not very important, right? But it's important that nobody knows who you're talking about and where they're going, right? But there were artillery strikes that were being called in. There were just so many different things happening during that time period. And keep in mind that we were attacking defensive positions that were in place, hardened, and we lost a lot of people in Iwo Jima. It's very... it's hard for me to really get the importance of how profound this was, because nowadays we encrypt things. So we don't need codes as much. We still have them, by the way. We still encode and decode. But because of the encryption that we have today, we don't have like a need for that any longer. But in that time, this was a profound advantage. This is a profound advantage to be able to send signals and communicate in a timely manner makes everything on the battlefield just operate better.
Yeah.
It reduces casualties, it reduces engagements, it reduces miscommunications and misunderstandings. And that was the value of the native peoples in this system. Now, they weren't treated well after the war, and they weren't treated well after World War I. Like we said, they weren't even citizens.
Yeah.
When they were being drafted, and so I want to highlight the fact that this was a profound thing. This was an amazing accomplishment. Had these boarding schools succeeded, how much would have changed just at Iwo Jima?
Yeah.
How many people are alive today and someone in their family served at Iwo Jima? There may be a great mind that would have never been born because if the code talkers if their culture had been destroyed and their language had been destroyed. And so a lot of times we don't have the foresight as humans to see the importance of something today. And the truth of the matter is that people didn't see the importance of native peoples being able to keep their names and keep their languages and keep their culture. And yet we capitalized on it when we needed to. We're always good at that.
Yeah.
And so I challenge people, think differently about the different. Think differently about the strange. Think differently about the unique. Because you don't know when that particular thing may be of tremendous value in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. I think specifically, it's one of those hard things, and this is something we talked about, but like there can't be improvement in movement towards the future while you're still actively discriminating against
yes.
Like we still, to this day, argue that it's okay to build a particular thing on this land without the consent of the people that we signed treaties for. We still go back on native treaties like in recent memory. Like you can look back in the last 10 years we've done it. And it seems like we're going to continue to do it. And I think that's one of those things. Is this the relationship that America has with Native with Native people, and the relationship those Native people have with America is one of like constant like constantly taking advantage of them and constantly going back on deals and constantly going back on treaties. That doesn't improve until that process stops. And we haven't even done that yet. We're still doing that. And we've made progress. I don't want it to seem like we haven't made progress, but clearly not enough. If we're still in 2021 saying, well, do they really have the right to not let us build a observatory up here? Or do they really have the right to not let us build a pipeline through here? And it's like,
yeah,
it has to stop at some point. If it doesn't, then you can't expect any kind of improvement to that relationship to those concepts. I mean, you can't fault someone for feeling like you're going to take advantage of them when you've essentially done nothing but take advantage of them throughout the history of.
And we talked about, it's not just taking advantage of them on property rights and things like that. I talked about this with you the other day.
Yeah,
it's taking advantage of them. I see it a lot. People that I don't know how to say, they steal a cultural identity.
Yeah.
And that might not be the right term.
I think I know what you mean.
But basically, here's the perfect example. I'm Senator blah or Congressman blah, and I am 1/116th Choctaw.
Yeah.
So I'm representing all Native Americans, even though I'm 1/116th of nothing and I have zero actual cultural tie to the Choctaw. I don't even maybe know a Choctaw.
Yeah.
I've never met a Choctaw, yet I'm claiming an identity that isn't mine. And I'm doing it for nefarious reasons. I'm not doing it because I'm going to represent the Choctaw. I'm not the Choctaw representative. I'm not making their lives better. I'm making my life better politically by using their culture without without that culture gaining anything from me.
Yeah.
And it's pirating. It's piracy in some ways. And I think that it shouldn't be acceptable to do so. Now, I mentioned to you, so I was born in Mexico. I got my citizenship in 1986 to be a U.S. citizen. But I never paraded around. I never grew up. I didn't grow up as a Hispanic, even though I was Hispanic. I grew up in the foster system. So I lost my language at a very early age. I spoke nothing but Spanish. I don't speak any Spanish anymore.
Yeah.
But you don't ever see me run around waving a Mexican flag, pretending to be something. I think it's disingenuous. Even though
I don't know if I agree for that particular example. And this is actually why, because I was thinking about this after we talked about this. And hear me out on this, because I agree with you. I think there's people that do this, especially with Native people, and historically with politicians. This is a thing we've seen, which is like this really disgusting claim of some kind of stake in Native peoples, while simultaneously, honestly, I'd be willing to like just be like, that's really weird that you said that. Like, I don't know if we can prove that. If they actually had they were making tangible benefits for the Native peoples, but they're not even doing that part, which is bullshit.
No.
But no, my thing is this, is that there's actually a lot of Native people that are stuck in this really weird place where they've been like forcefully watered down, like their culture, to a point where like they don't know it. They're in a similar state where they can't. Their language was taken from their grandparents. They'd never learned that language. The culture was taken from their parents and their grandparents. They never learned the culture.
Yes.
I think that those people still have a right and should still, like, I don't think there's an issue with those people going back and being like, you know what, I do want to try to recapture that culture, even if I can do it a little bit.
Oh, absolutely.
I think that's fair. And I think but I think it's the same for you. I think that if I don't think it's disingenuous for you to claim like that you're a Hispanic American because you're a Hispanic American.
Right.
I don't think it's disingenuous.
What I'm saying is that I don't run around pretending like I understand something that I culturally I got removed from that.
Yeah.
I don't have those ties anymore. So I don't pretend like I do.
Okay, I got you. I see. I think that's fair.
And that I believe that is disingenuous. If you don't have ties to something, it doesn't matter. Like my life took the route that it took. I didn't have a choice in that.
Yeah.
But if I were to run around trying to pretend like I grew up somewhere that I didn't and had experiences that I didn't, I don't believe that is disingenuous to those people.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I can see that. It gets complicated when we're talking about the people that are affected like through their ancestry, like the actual people who, like, because there's a difference. There's the people that clearly take this concept without being able to be provable. By the way, you're probably 1% just about everything in the world. If you're like,
we did that.
If you're like an American, especially if you're an American citizen, because America has just a huge amount of diversity within it. I am literally not more than 20% anything in the world. I am mixed as hell. Like I cannot point to a racial group and be like, oh, I am majority this percent. I'm not any of those things. And a lot of people fall into that boat, honestly. But when you go in, if you do one of those DNA tests, you will find that you are probably down the line 1% something.
Of something somewhere.
And if your family was, if you know that you don't have access to those cultural things, because of what's happened to your family historically, I think it's admirable to be like, okay, I want to capture something. I mean, I'm not gonna dox him or anything, but my best friend, I mean, we've had similar-ish conversations about his native blood and the staying true to his culture while staying true to the rest of his family's culture. And I'm not going to speak for his own feelings for that, but that's a really complicated process to deal with. Which adds to that, when you hear the word, like, people use these words wrong a lot, or people think of these words wrong a lot, but when you talk about things like generational trauma, that's what we're talking about. It's the buildup of issues that are unresolved over time. So essentially, these are things that we have done and not provided any kind of resolution, any kind of assistance for, and we let fester for generations and generations, and then you get these really complicated, strange manifestations of these issues because you left them to go. Native people in this country face really specific issues when it comes to infrastructure. I believe
Big time.
that they're the group that's most likely to not have running water in their systems. Really big issues with poverty. A lot of these things were created by design and then never resolved. It might not be an active thing now where someone's like, I want to keep the Native Americans down.
No,
but
it's just ignored.
Yeah, it's the decision of not fixing the things that we've done historically.
Part of the reason for that is because you don't see it. So, for example, a reservation is a reservation. It's a dividing line, and so I don't have access necessarily to every reservation. And normally, I don't have any, and I'm not being. I don't have any business there.
Yeah, you don't have a reason to.
Like, I don't have a reason to go there. And so I don't see the conditions of a reservation unless I want to see the conditions of a reservation. It doesn't make me a bad person. It just means that I don't have any reason to be there. And so they're kind of forgotten because they're off to the side. They're underrepresented. They're absolutely underrepresented, and politically, and that's a problem. That's a very big problem, because if you don't have any representation at the government level, then you don't get you don't get the same changes. The changes are very slow when you have no representation. Representation in government, in our government, is key. And so a lot of times you'll see things that you're like, well, I cannot believe people live like this in a first world nation. Think about that for 1 second. There are people that live so far below the poverty barrier that we would not recognize it as being in America. I've been around the world and I've seen poverty in so many different countries, like real poverty, actual real poverty. And I will tell you that it's that feeling. I get that feeling when I look into this, because I've seen that in other places, and it's like, this is crazy. It's absolutely crazy when you think about it. And now the other problem we run into is jealousy. Well, tax-free, they shouldn't be taxed. They should have to pay taxes for cigarettes. But I have friends that go down to the, I don't know if it's called duty-free, the smoke shop. To get untaxed cigarettes for them and all their friends. I'm not saying they're bad people. Okay? Look, you take advantage of the things that you can take advantage of. Okay, that's human nature. Okay, if I can save money, I'll save money. But at the same time, the people that are saving money are upset that they get to do this tax-free thing. but they don't live like those other people do either. They don't even know how they live, most of them. They don't even know their level of poverty. Casinos. Oh, people all manner of upset about casinos. Well, I should be able to make $1 billion too.
Mm-hmm.
Like, look, come on. If you have an asset, and I'm saying this for the native peoples, if you have an asset, you take advantage of it.
Yeah. Especially when you don't have a lot of prospects.
Yes.
And you don't have a lot of options for taking advantage.
Now, what is the solution? The solution is quite literally that there has to be an acceptance of their culture and their differences. There has to be a respect for agreements. Okay. There has to be a respect for agreements, and they have to get some actual representation. And this is a problem. So I want to put this for every, I'm just going to say it. Okay. My city is represented by somebody. My district is represented by somebody. My state is represented by somebody. Right? Based off of my population.
Yeah.
All right. Whose district are the reservations? Who's representing them? And should we add people to Congress and the Senate based off of populations of these different native tribes? That sounds like a solution to me. So instead of,
I should say, I don't, is that, I don't know what the current system are. I think native people are counted towards populations for representation, right? Aren't they?
True, but at the same time, they're other, remember?
That is
and
true.
What I'm saying is that they should be represented just like Tucson is represented, just like Phoenix, or just like Pima County is represented. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. I mean...
And if you do something like that, then all of a sudden, all these different reservations, all these different states start actually getting some actual representation.
Yeah.
Trust me on this. They not just only have a say in what goes on those reservations, then they have a say in what's going on in your town.
Yeah. And you have a say on what's going in their town. It's just we don't think about it that way. Yeah.
And that's what I'm getting at, is that we're so focused on what we're doing. I think that is honestly the real solution. Yeah. And at a certain point, it makes them a part of something.
Yeah.
Okay. They're no longer a separate nation. They're no longer a separate something.
Yeah.
They are beginning to become inclusive.
Yeah, I mean,
and that might not be the solution, but I will say that I believe that would have more of a profound effect for the native peoples than a bunch of protests or a bunch of people discussing things for them. I don't represent them. I wouldn't dream of discussing or pushing for certain reforms for them, because I don't know what they need. And that's not my place. But what I am saying is that I believe that the easiest way, the smartest way, would be to actually get them to have their own representation, so that they can ask for the things that they require.
Yeah, I would want to do more research before I said one way or another. I mean, I'd need to see like how the current system is set up for it. But I agree. I mean, shout out to Deb Haaland, the first Native American Interior Secretary. For those of you that don't know, the Department of the Interior are the people that manage the Department of Indian Affairs and a whole bunch of like internal land stuff. That is insane that we got to 2021 before we had a Native American in charge of the department that's in charge of Native American land.
Their stuff.
That's insane. Also, she's a badass, which helps as well. But I would agree. I think representation is important. And we have an interesting bonus segment we're going to talk about along that similar-ish line as well once we're done here. But any other thoughts to wrap up for the Code Talkers specifically Native Americans in the military, anything like that?
Well, I would like to say that I was unaware at how involved the Native peoples were in conflicts in the Americas.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of I would say it's probably an under exposed,
Yeah, I agree.
not highlighted,
Mm-hmm.
and so I for all of for all of the tribes that have participated in military service uh, honorably, I would like to thank them for their service.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people say it. It's this kind of catchphrase.
Yeah.
Not me. Thank you for your service, and thank you for your dedication, and thank you for your perseverance.
Yeah.
It's an actual struggle to be a certain person in this world. And that there's several different certain persons.
Yeah.
But life can be more difficult for one person over another person. And especially if your starting point is a reservation.
Yeah.
And so I will say that a lot of the reasons that Native peoples go into the military is probably less to do with patriotism and more to do with economics. And I'm not saying that in a bad way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I was in the system. I was in the military, and there were financial benefits to doing so. I get that. But I will say that is a lucrative thing. A steady paycheck, three hots and a cot, medical, dental, those
education
things,
bills,
education, to be able, to be able to go to college, be able to send your kids to college. I mean, look, that's enticing for someone that is below the poverty level.
Yeah.
So it's a lucrative thing, and so I want to thank them for their service, but I also want to recognize why that might actually be taking place.
Yeah.
It might be that is just the best option for them, is to come into the military. And now their service in the military is all dependent on each and every individual.
Yeah.
And that isn't just for Native Americans. That's for every individual that ever served and has ever served. They make it their own.
Yeah.
But yeah, I definitely would say, thank them, and thank their fathers, their mothers, anyone that's participated.
Yeah.
Because they have made an impact. And their honor and their service has it was unrecognized because it was classified for these code talkers. But now that it's unclassified, we can shout it from the rooftops how important this was.
Yeah.
How profound it was in theater.
I agree.
So
I agree. And Ginger says based woke James. Yeah.
I don't know what that means.
Wow, it's the kids talk. You wouldn't know. Yeah, I would agree with that sentiment. I think that's all true. And with that, thank you for listening to this episode. We really appreciate it. Again, you can always please follow us on whatever podcast service you're currently listening to. We're happy to have you there. You can also check us out on YouTube. If you go to the War Room Podcast on YouTube, you can click in the description if you're listening to the podcast version of this. You can see the recording of this. Lastly, if you want to follow us live, if you want to get notifications next time we go live on Twitch, you can go to twitch.tv/War Room Podcast. From there, you can follow us to be able to get notifications anytime we go online, as well as participate in any of the segments we do, any of the bonus segments that we do after the fact as well. But we do really appreciate you listening. Again, please share this podcast with anyone you think might be interested in it. We've been getting pretty decent views on our stuff, and we are enjoying doing this. So we hope that y'all are enjoying us doing it as well. With that, thank you so much. And we hope it's Mother's Day now when we're doing this recording. So for any of the mothers out there, thank you so much for everything you've done and everything you do. Really appreciate it. As someone who has a mother. So
get your shots.
Yes.
Wear your mask, please.
Please do. And with that, thank you so much. Bye, y'all.
Bye.